Gracias a todos por participar.
Gracias a ti, Angélica.
Vale, Angélica. Entonces, inicio a las 3, ¿sí? En punto.
Ya en 2 minutitos entonces. Perfecto.
Dale.
Ya el YouTube está. Ya Angelo me dijo que ya estaba al aire. Este es la pieza que nos mandamos y que ya estamos en vivo, dice Angelo. Listo, Estíbalis, cuando quieras.
Buenas tardes a todos. Bienvenidos a la presentación del libro Guía para construir un clima escolar. Estamos aquí desde la Filbo, desde el stand 502 pabellón 3 del segundo piso. Estamos aquí transmitiendo también en nuestra pantalla digital el evento. Tenemos aquí el libro, también en la feria, y también los invitamos a que puedan entrar a ediciones.uniandes.edu.co. El libro también se encuentra en ebook. Bienvenidos y muchas gracias por acompañarnos en esta Feria 2023.
Muchas gracias, Estíbalis. Yo también quiero darles una cordial bienvenida a todos los que nos están escuchando en este momento al lanzamiento del libro Guía para construir un clima escolar seguro. Estoy aquí con 2 de los coautores y mi nombre es Stephanie Mayerovich y yo soy profesora de la Escuela de Gobierno y tengo hoy el placer de estar en una conversación con los dos de los autores del libro sobre temas muy relevantes para Colombia y para toda Latinoamérica que iríamos conversando. Les quiero dar la bienvenida a los 2 autores y que van a iniciar con una breve presentación del libro. Primero tenemos al profesor Ron Avi Astor, profesor de Trabajo Social en UCLA, que nos acompaña desde allá. Y tenemos también a Laura Liévano-Karim, que es estudiante doctoral, candidata al doctorado en Trabajo Social en la Universidad también de California en Los Ángeles. Bienvenidos a ambos y empecemos entonces con la presentación de parte de ustedes.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, for this wonderful introduction. And to the audience and those people listening, I want to apologize that my Spanish is not very good. So I'm giving the lecture in English, but we have a wonderful interpreter. So I want to thank her very much, Jenny. Thank you for that. I'm also super thrilled that this book is coming out in Spanish. And I could give you a little bit of a background of how we started this idea and this process going back 30 years ago. My colleague Rami Benbenishty, who was unable to be here right now because of the time differences with Israel, and I have projects all over the world, in California, in Quebec, in Kosovo, Cameroon, beforehand in Taiwan, China, and in Chile as well, among other places. And we found very early on in our area of school safety and how do you create a positive school climate, that many of the interventions that were being created in academia, in universities, were called evidence-based, I'm putting that in quotes, because they were run through studies that showed that they worked in that particular study. But when we took those ideas and we put them out for entire cities or entire countries or entire regions within a country, they tended not to work. They didn't work very well. Many of them failed. And one of the reasons when we go into the schools, because we spend a whole lot of time in schools in Israel and in Chile and in the United States and other places, we found that every location had very unique needs, unique perspectives, unique cultural backgrounds, and also unique political structures that weren't just the big political structures. Some of them were very local and particular to each place. So even with schools in the same communities, there might be 20, 30, 100, or 1,000 schools, depending on the cities that we were looking at. Every school was very different. Now, my wife has been a principal for 35 years, and she says, of course, every school is different. She would look at me and say, oh, you need a research study to tell you that. And my daughter's been in education for 15 years, and she says the same thing. And I was a teacher beforehand as well. And I know that every school is different, and every school over time is different. But somehow the way we go and intervene, the way we talk about policies is very static. It's very top down and not bottom up. In the last 20 years, people have come up and said, we should listen to the voices of the students a little bit better. We should actually take into account what they think and how they feel about their climate and situations. We should also be listening to the teachers. The teachers are, and principals, they're actually responsible for creating the positive climate in the schools. And what about the parents who are bringing their kids to the schools? Is the school actually reflecting what they believe in, what they care about, what their culture is, and where they foresee their children, where they want to be? And unfortunately, many of the interventions created in academia are very top-down, like I said earlier, and when they apply, they don't hit all the needs, particularly of the parents, the kids, and the teachers. So we came up with this monitoring system of saying, well, we have surveys, but usually those are used as evaluations, pre and post, or usually they're used as ways to monitor entire countries. What if we actually didn't think of them as surveys or as data? What if we actually thought of children who are answering or youth answering these questions, but this is their voice. This isn't just 5 students taking a video camera and telling us what they think and representing all kids. This could be 1,000 kids in a school. This could be 2,000 kids in a school, all giving their diverse opinions. And that's what we find. Not all the kids agree on everything. You might have half the kids thinking one thing and half the kids thinking another thing. Same with the teachers, same with the administrators, same with the parents. We would survey them or give them qualitative methods, like a mapping technique that we developed that's in the book as well, too. So you could use qualitative methods. Where do you feel comfortable? Where do you love being in the school? What areas are safe actually walking to in school? And flip side is, what areas are unsafe? Where do you avoid going? What happens in those situations? So you can actually map that out on a map and then have discussions in focus groups with kids, teachers, parents. You could do the same with quantitative surveys. Now, the reason why this became so important for us, not just at one school or an individual school, but to do this across, could we do this across, in our mind, an entire city? Could we do it across an entire state? Could we do it across an entire country? And so that's what we tried out about 25 years ago. Could you ask kids in each of these schools across, let's say, California has 10,000 schools, gather their opinions, and then use that both at the local level to create a very catered program for that period of time for those students, parents, and community members, but at the same time, not have the same program, the exact same kind of top-down program for every school in the state. That was our challenge. That was our goal. How do we move this to scale so every place has its own culture, its own background, its own needs, its own resources looked at, but at the same time, all the schools in the country or the state or the region are doing it slightly different according to their own needs. Now, I'll give you some cultural context that's international. We started this first project off in Israel. And if people know what's been going on in Israel, you can see the political context. You're going to be talking about politics entering it. Of course, it enters education. But you have cultural issues, you have religious issues, you have language issues per each school. And how do you then, as a country or as a region, adapt the needs of each particular school to hit every single one of those layers and each one of those different groups? And that's where we started the first kind of countrywide monitoring system. So again, that each school has a 3-year process through which they take the individual data from the parents and kids and community members, and they come up with their own solution that's local, that then could marshal resources from all over the community or nationally, or use professionals like psychologists or social workers or counselors to help bring those resources to the school. Again, you might have 10 schools in one city or in a region, and each one of those schools is doing something slightly different according to what they're willing to work on. That last piece that I said is really important, because some of the things that we forget sometimes when we think of intervention is we always think that schools should be doing what's needed. Where are the gaps? But the other thing that we found about is that schools, and particularly professionals in schools, will only work on what they want to work on. So it's not always the greatest need, it's what they're willing to put their energy and time in. And that's not always the same as researchers or policymakers. It could be that they start with different issues, and I could give many examples if you want to talk about that. But we think it's important from a ground-up welcoming empowerment perspective to actually start with where the community, what the kids, parents want to work on. Sometimes it's controversial. So again, what we started to see in Israel was, again, there were really different needs, particularly from secular Jewish Israelis to modern Orthodox Israelis to ultra-Orthodox, or then Muslim, and then Christian Arabs within Israel. And then within the Arab group, we had huge variation between Bedouin groups, Druze groups, and other, again, different Christian sects and different Muslim sects that were in Israel, that were all playing themselves out in very culturally focused schools. And so each one of those types of schools and types of things had to develop its own strategies at the local level, but also those actually filtered back up to the Ministry of Education, so that they started turning some of these patterns that were common amongst the various different kinds of cultural schools into policy. So usually policy starts top down and goes down to the school. And this way it went reverse. It went from the policy back up to the ministry and down. And this is what's surprising. With everything that you know and you hear about what's going on in Israel with war, we've had massive decreases in school violence during this period of time. Even in the midst of war, even in the midst of huge cultural strife, and big increases in positive school climate. And that's true almost across the board with the Arab, ultra-Orthodox, Orthodox, and secular schools, even though they don't all get along. That's been happening. I'll give you another example. In California, they've also been using a monitoring system similar to what we have, that we piloted in some of our smaller areas like San Diego region and others. Again, if you've been following the news of what's been happening in the United States, we've had a lot of school shootings, which is very not common in other places around the world, and massive, probably not more than every other place in the world, but it's really high in terms of political strife and political tension, particularly around issues of race and resources and structural racism. So what we hear, what we feel sometimes in the United States is that everything's getting worse in terms of school violence. But in fact, when you look at this monitoring kind of data from the school to school place, actually things are going right there. We've had massive reductions in California, 50 to 70% on some of the things. We just released a big article in the World Journal of Pediatrics last week, that in the midst of all this turmoil that's happening politically, if communities listen to their kids, if communities actually listen to their teachers, and I'm not saying all of them do all the time, but if they have a way of doing it that's local, that's meaningful, actually the resources that they bring forth work. And that's an important message we think that the book brings across, because usually people throw up their hands and say, in the United States, I'll give an example, mental health. How can we handle it? And it's so overwhelming and so strong that they don't know where to start. And this is a great way to start, actually, at the local level, at the voices of the students and the parents and the teachers, at that period of time in terms of what they need and what they're willing to work on. And we see that California has dropped, by the way, 95% of our 10,000 schools, we've seen reductions. Stronger reductions for African-American students and for Latinx students than any other group, particularly because those schools have added resources. By the way, it's not just programs, it's resources. They've connected with community, they've applied for more grants, they've advocated for more. So that's a second example in the United States. A similar process happened in Chile over the last 10 years. And Veronica Lopez is our partner there. Hopefully she's listening to it as well. She's done an amazing job. It's about in 75% of their schools. And we've seen, obviously it's had to be adapted to the Chilean context and to the many Chilean contexts that are there. Now we're doing something similar in Kosovo, which has a completely different history of ethnic cleansing and genocide. It's one of the only Muslim countries, majority Muslim in Europe. And there's a lot of issues related to that right now. So we're in the midst of adapting. What does that mean for a Muslim country, particularly in a European context? So I'll give you one where it's failed. We have the same book that Laura actually worked on. We actually were working with projects in China. So here's a political context where actually the basis of what this book is built on, which is empowerment, voice, listening to the community from the ground up, and making change from the ground up, actually has been rejected by the Chinese government. They're a little bit afraid that if we bring this up to school, so the book is about to go to publication and they stopped it. And the rationale was just recently that we heard about it, was that they thought it gave too much voice and decision-making and power to the students, the parents, and the local area. And actually, they felt that it needed to be more top-down driven. So they don't want that book published right now in China. They'll wait, which is an interesting kind of cultural difference. It's written, say that again? Okay, yeah, that cultural context is different because it's not a democracy. It's a much more I want to say totalitarian kind of centralized government where things are run differently. So this may not work in every context, but I think it might work well in the Latin context, especially with the wide interest and focus on democracy. At least many groups would like that, and voice and empowerment, particularly of youth and disempowered cultures. And so that's the general spirit. I could go on and on, but my time is up. I promised to do this in 15 minutes. And I just want to hand this over to Laura as well, because when we approached her for the book, there we go, stop. When we approached her for the book, one of our goals was not just to take our context and to move it into Spanish, which is obviously very important, but was to try and see if we could adapt the cultural context of particularly Latin America, which is hard to do because there's so many different countries with different structures, but to see if it could be more aligned with the political and social structures in Latin America. So our translation, our year-long debate, discussions with every chapter back and forth, were not only about language, they were about culture as well with the examples. And with that, I will hand this over to Laura.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias. Esa introducción estuvo pues perfecta. Por mi lado les quería contar que fue muy satisfactorio ser parte de este proyecto. Estuve muy interesada cuando me invitaron a ser parte del equipo por varias razones que tiene esta guía para construir un clima escolar seguro y ya mencionadas por el profesor Astor, por mi profesor, pero pues que quería como resaltar eran la importancia que se le da a los estudiantes como las personas quienes están viviendo dichas realidades en los contextos, pues en sus diferentes colegios. Entonces, esta importancia que se les da al ser parte de los actores a quienes invitamos para escuchar sus voces, para saber qué están viviendo, cuáles son sus experiencias, qué percepciones tienen sobre las diferentes como problemáticas o situaciones en sus diferentes colegios, pues me parecía fundamental y una cosa que en general hago como investigadora pues en las áreas en las que trabajo. Me gustó también mucho esta transición o este puente que creamos de usar herramientas de recolección de datos que en algunos casos se ven asociadas exclusivamente o más que todo con la investigación, tales como los grupos focales, las cartografías sociales, unas pues encuestas de 10.000, 20.000 personas, ese tipo de herramientas. Entonces me gustó que esta guía escolar busca volver estas herramientas tangibles para un uso práctico de prevención de violencia o de mejorar el clima escolar dentro de estos diferentes dentro de diferentes colegios en el contexto latinoamericano. También mencionado por el doctor Astor fue esto del empoderamiento de las voces de los jóvenes. Entonces se les daba como esta guía, busca también construir, crear una plataforma para que sus ideas, sus experiencias, sus percepciones y todo sean como explotadas de la mejor manera. Y por último, el tercer punto de por qué todo este proyecto me pareció algo muy satisfactorio y algo muy importante para el contexto de Latinoamérica, era cómo logramos por medio de estas herramientas, por medio del empoderamiento de los jóvenes, de escuchar sus voces y sus experiencias, tener información contextualizada y específica a ciertas como situaciones que se están viviendo pues muy específicamente en diferentes colegios. Entonces, tal como fue mencionado en la introducción del libro, pueden haber colegios en una misma comunidad o en una misma región con problemáticas muy diferentes. Entonces, este tipo de sistemas de monitoreo nos da la posibilidad de distinguir cuáles son esas diferentes como capas de problemáticas que existen en los diferentes colegios. Y bueno, también al final con respecto a la traducción como del idioma, pero también a la traducción como interpretación en un contexto latinoamericano, para mí fue muy valioso poder ser parte de este proyecto donde traíamos esto pues en español a Latinoamérica, pues al lugar donde originalmente soy. Entonces fue un proyecto pues muy simbólico en ese sentido. Y ya con esto concluyo mi pequeña intervención con respecto al libro, que los invito a todos a leer, en especial si trabajan como en contextos pues de educación y en colegios.
Muchas gracias, Laura. Muchas gracias, Ron. Yo, digamos, quiero hacer un breve comentario sobre el libro en el contexto colombiano. Lo leí con muchísimo interés. Es un libro que es supremamente pertinente para el contexto colombiano y diría, de hecho, latinoamericano. Una de las grandes ventajas de esta guía, para los que todavía no han tenido la oportunidad de leerlo, es una guía muy práctica que le da a un colegio, a todos los actores que están en un colegio, el paso a paso de cómo pueden crear un sistema de seguimiento y monitoreo que les permita entender cuál es la situación que está viviendo su colegio en términos de clima escolar, temas como matoneo, violencia y distintos otros problemas que no tienen que ver directamente con el aprendizaje, que normalmente no se piensan en el contexto directo de colegio, enseñanza, aprendizaje, pero que tienen todo que ver con el aprendizaje de los estudiantes. Y me parece que es supremamente relevante el libro por dos razones. Uno, porque el tema del clima escolar se ha vuelto cada vez más pertinente y más importante. O sea, creo que siempre ha sido pertinente e importante, pero hemos tenido mayor comprensión de la importancia del tema del clima escolar en el contexto de los aprendizajes de los estudiantes. Creo que en el lado académico, pero también en el lado de política pública y en los mismos ambientes escolares, nos hemos venido dando cuenta del peligro que puede ser los temas como matoneo, como los riesgos a la salud mental de los estudiantes, no solo como temas secundarios, sino como principales en realmente incidir sobre los aprendizajes de los estudiantes. Eso, sobre todo, traído aún más en relevancia en el momento de la pandemia, cuando los estudiantes se ven obligados a las casas y la salud mental se volvió un problema muy, muy importante. Y en segundo grado, pues en estos cambios que hemos tenido con las redes sociales y el incremento de matoneo virtual, que también han resaltado un poquito este problema del clima escolar y que le voy a preguntar más adelante a los autores, puede también ser un reto para estos sistemas de monitoreo cuando sacan el matoneo y el clima escolar del ambiente escolar y lo ponen en situaciones ocultas. La segunda razón por la cual me parece muy interesante y muy pertinente este libro para Colombia y aplica mucho más allá del sistema escolar es en la importancia que le dan a la recolección de información desde todos los actores para saber básicamente en qué estamos. Es muy común y aquellos que me han oído hablar en distintas ocasiones saben que yo soy una promotora de los sistemas de seguimiento y monitoreo y de la importancia de tener información sobre, uno, cómo estamos, que normalmente no tenemos información sobre cómo estamos en términos de aprendizajes, de bienestar social, de distintos temas que aplica de nuevo mucho más allá del sistema escolar. Y sobre todo, si identificamos un problema, hay matoneo en un colegio, los estudiantes están teniendo un problema de clima escolar y se genera alguna solución, una intervención para tratar de solucionarlo, normalmente tampoco tenemos idea de si esa solución, si esa intervención logra solucionar el problema o no. Implementamos un taller, implementamos una charla, implementamos alguna cosa y esperamos que eso resuelva el problema sin nunca tener idea de si eso sirvió o no. Y la importancia de estos sistemas de seguimiento y monitoreo es simplemente darnos es ir andando con una lámpara que nos dé un poco de luz en dónde estamos parados y hacia dónde vamos. Y aquí es donde yo creo que hay un reto muy importante. Colombia, como muchos países de la región, ha venido, yo creo, yo he trabajado también en Perú, sobre todo, ha venido avanzando mucho en sistemas de seguimiento y monitoreo, tanto a nivel de los ministerios como tratando de aterrizarlo a niveles más, a nivel escolar. Pero la implementación de estos sistemas tiene unos retos muy importantes y es donde me gustaría tener una conversación con los autores del libro, y es que muchas veces estos sistemas se implementan con una mirada hacia la fiscalización, hacia el castigo, hacia si ustedes no cumplen ciertas metas, van a tener unas consecuencias muy, muy graves. Entonces eso genera un rechazo de parte de los actores. En Colombia, digamos, los profesores de los colegios, que tienen un sindicato de profesores bastante fuerte, son reacios a tener constantes mediciones de lo que están haciendo, porque en otras situaciones ha sucedido que se use esto para decir, bueno, sus estudiantes no están aprendiendo, usted tiene la culpa, lo vamos a castigar. Y los sistemas de monitoreo se pierden su sentido, el sentido de ser, y se vuelven una manera de castigar a los profesores. Y eso genera un rechazo desde el punto de vista de no quiero tener monitoreo lo que estoy haciendo porque me van a castigar por eso. Y en vez de pensarlo como una herramienta de aprendizaje, que es lo que debería ser al final del día, deberíamos usar esto para aprender y no necesariamente para castigar, porque en ese momento ya se vuelve digamos, una herramienta que genera rechazo desde los profesores y que además pues puede perder todo el sentido, porque si yo tengo susto de que si yo no cumplo una meta me van a castigar, pues voy a tener incentivos a manipular esa meta. Y en el momento en que el indicador se vuelve manipulable, ya no sabemos ni dónde estamos parados ni hacia dónde vamos. Entonces, esos retos de, digamos, por un lado, que se use para el aprendizaje y no para el castigo, que es un reto que me encantaría oír al profesor Astor, cómo les ha ido en situaciones donde lo han implementado con ese reto de que se use para el aprendizaje y no para castigar. Y por el otro lado, tenemos el riesgo de que el sistema de monitoreo se implemente como un checklist, ¿no? Entonces se vuelve una carga adicional para los docentes, para el cuerpo administrativo, para el rector, de cosas que tienen que llenar y no se ve la utilidad de utilizar esos datos. Entonces, eso nos ha pasado en Colombia, donde con todas las mejores intenciones cada vez estamos exigiéndole más a los gobiernos locales y a las entidades gubernamentales que hagan sistemas de seguimiento y monitoreo. Entonces, ellos les toca hacer esa tarea, nunca ven la utilidad, lo hacen como una carga adicional, pero no lo utilizan para la toma de decisiones. Entonces, ese doble reto de, digamos, entendiendo que los sistemas son una herramienta poderosísima para saber dónde estamos y hacia dónde vamos, cómo superar esos dos retos. Por un lado, que no se use para castigar, para perjudicar a las personas, que podamos fracasar y aprender de esos fracasos sin riesgo, sin miedo a que eso nos perjudique. Y por el otro lado, cómo hacer que sean útiles. Yo sé que en el libro ustedes hablan mucho de la importancia de que esos datos, que esa información se use, pero yo he visto que es bien difícil lograr esa apropiación de las herramientas en el contexto real y se vuelven o algo que le tengo miedo porque me va a perjudicar, o algo que es una carga que me toca hacerlo, pero que realmente no le veo ningún beneficio y que simplemente me quita más tiempo y le añade a mi carga laboral. Entonces, me gustaría, ahorita que abramos la discusión, que hablemos de esos dos temas. Y el tema adicional que les mencionaba antes, y es ya hablando de clima escolar como tal, ¿cómo han cambiado digamos, las situaciones que ustedes han visto en los colegios en los últimos años, ya sea a través de la pandemia, bueno, donde se cerraron los colegios, pero sobre todo con estas nuevas modalidades de matoneo, de bullying a través de las redes sociales, y cómo eso nos da limitaciones a lo que podemos mirar en los colegios, porque al final del día esto es enfocado en los colegios, pero todo eso afecta lo que está pasando en el colegio, si bien se sale un poco del ámbito escolar y es más difícil de ver. Entonces, cómo esas nuevas tecnologías y lo que hemos oído que las redes sociales y no sé, Instagram y TikTok y eso ha tenido un impacto muy negativo sobre la salud mental de los jóvenes y sobre todo las niñas, y cómo eso afecta estos temas que estamos hablando. Entonces, yo creo que con eso me gustaría abrir la conversación para que los autores me cuenten un poquito qué opinan de estos temas, y vamos conversando en Spanglish.
Great. Laura, did you want to respond to some of these first, or do you want me to go? Okay. All right. So first, thank you. I really appreciate your analysis and your perspective on this, and I think you're spot on many of your comments. There were a lot of layers, so let me see if I could piece out some of them. One of the things that you mentioned is the punishment issue. This is something we've written in our academic chapters, books, a whole lot. And by the way, this is a theme in school reform in general, all around the world. Do we want to create societies where we encourage people to actually thrive, to build on positive reinforcement, on welcoming, on caring, or do we believe that human behavior is mainly driven by punishment, by rules, by authority? So these are big themes in education. Obviously, it's probably a combination of the both. You need boundaries and rules, but you also, at least most academicians that I know, would fall on the image of a school, and this is probably true in almost every culture, as being a place where we uplift children. We add on to what their families and communities do to enlighten and to create opportunities for them and to create wonderful friendships. And I think this relates to an image of how we see society, right? So it's not just the monitoring systems. I agree with you that this is a major problem with the monitoring systems. It's connected with wider structures of whether we punish populations or whether we believe that empowerment is actually a good thing for people. So I want to nest it in that. And I think that's a good reason why in China it was shut down right away, because there's a very strong philosophical belief that we don't want to hear the student's voice right now. Sounded like a good idea, I think, perhaps for some people, because maybe they could take that information and use it against the kids and teachers. We actually, in our naivete, did not think of that. But now that actually people are getting excited and talking, maybe some higher ups don't want that. So I think your focus on the punishment and the empowerment is really strong. And I think even for those who believe in positive empowerment, you have to kind of get over that, get used to it. So let me give you a couple of concrete examples of things that we've done in different countries to facilitate that process. So in Israel and Kosovo and in Chile, what we did in the first few years, we were able to work and convince the authorities higher up to allow the schools to not see this as data, because usually in monitoring systems, the data goes to the principals, it goes to the district, it goes to the ministry, it goes this. We wanted it first to go back to the kids. These are your voices. This is what you said. This is not just what one said. You have, and again, there's never quite uniformity. Kids have different opinions. It goes back to focus groups. They discuss it amongst themselves. Then we did the same thing with teachers in those schools. So again, the data was not for the minister. The data was for the teacher. So that really matters a whole lot. I'll give a couple examples in Chile. It worked very well. They had that kind of predisposition anyways for empowerment and for empowering youth in some of the schools that we were working. We were in Valparaiso at first, and then later in Santiago, and then later it spread out to other regions across. What we decided to do is to give a kind of a shelter of 2 or 3 years, if we could, for and we got authorities to agree to that, so that schools had a chance to take the voices of the students and the teachers and to create something. Like you said, it doesn't always work, but to create something and piece something together that's meaningful to them. And that brings in their culture, it brings in their religion, it brings in their language, so that it makes sense to them in the certain school level. And then you'll have a diversity of different solutions. So that's wonderful, because if you could give them the 3-year kind of breathing period, and that's in Israel, though, that same process, the politicians were fighting back and forth. So they actually have 2 systems. They have an external system that they do every 3 years, and they have an internal system that's quiet, that's just for themselves every year. And actually, I think it's that internal system that keeps it going, because that's what they really work on. And the kids come up with amazing solutions, and so do the teachers and the community members. Again, they don't always work. I'll give you a couple examples from just to enliven the examples so you can see what I'm really talking about. In California, in some of the schools, some of the kids and teachers came and said, you know, my solution to the bullying in school climate is we need big gardens in our schoolyard. We want to build all sorts of gardens, community gardens, our own gardens, all the grade levels will do it. I kind of thought, that's not what I was thinking of when I was thinking school climate. I don't know, but that's what they wanted. That's what they started working. We helped them write a little grant, and they went, about 3 schools did this. And it was phenomenal. It was so amazing to see the kids and the teachers go out into the gardens and plant things, and some were using science on it. And they were bringing in community and different cultural groups and how they cooked with the food and how they did things I would have never thought of. But we didn't stop there. When we had an example like that, we then videotaped it. We made a 3-minute video, and then we sent it to another 147 schools locally and said, this may or may not work for you. Do you want to come and visit and see what it's like? That particular, so this is in the 3-year period. Those schools then started doing kind of a pilgrimage to that particular. By the end of 3 years, we had 95 gardens in the different schools, community gardens. Not me. It was spreading by positive things, not punishment, not rules, not programs coming, but seeing other kids start. They weren't all exactly the same, but they tried. Another example, one of our schools came up, the kids saw it, there was bullying, they say being nice matters. That was their theme that the 7th graders came up with. The teachers agreed with it. They were able to get the city council, this was in California, in Temecula, not far away from where we were at. They got the banks, they got the fire department, the police department, actually painted all the buses in psychedelic kind of 1960s-ish color. Yes, they did that with banners. And again, I wasn't sure, but that one was interesting. The first round that didn't work in reducing the climate and creating, but we loved it because it was bringing in the community. So we said, let's work on it harder. They did. By the 2nd and 3rd year, they had pretty large reductions. And again, that became a place where welcoming and community school pieces became an example. We wouldn't have come up with that necessarily. By the way, I still go there. They don't know I had anything to do with this. This is 10 years later. And I still see the banners and people are wearing the shirts and the gardens are still there. So it's because the community owned it and because it's continually being evaluated at the local level. I'll give you one more example that you said, how do you get the teachers? With some of the more severe things like weapon use, being threatened by gangs or criminal groups on the way to and from school, or suicidal ideation. Even though California, for example, collected that data, they were doing that at the system level. Nobody looked at it at the local level. Surprising, right? So when we would take the data, let's say of the 7th graders or the 9th graders or the 11th graders in California, and we would for the first time present to them, you have 35% of your kids sitting in your math classes, actually not thinking about math, but they say they want to die and they have a method. That's a very different thinking process. The teacher imagining the faces of the kids in her classroom versus an abstract idea of mental health, that kids' mental health and COVID is getting. These are the children that teacher is teaching now. And then when we come back and we say, you know, we've had a focus group with these kids and kids are saying, yeah, this is how we bring that back to the teachers and the teachers to the kids, we see a softening of heart around the more difficult stretching thing. The very strict teachers, the ones who want to publish, begin to say, well, maybe we should have some social emotional things in our classes, even in the math classes. And that's a process. That's a process of hearing the voice, hearing the pain, not abstracting it to something far, and actually committing to doing this every year. That this is part of what we do in schooling. Again, the notion of schooling is it's not just to read, it's not just it's the kind of society and people we want to create. And if you have, so what, now the advantage of having this is we do this for the whole state. We actually were able to pull out the schools that did it well, not that we're doing bad, and use those as for the whole state, both in Israel and here, that people could go and learn from. And that's positive. That's really positive. That uplifts people, it gives them examples. We were not able to stop politicians, though. You're 100% right, from taking some of this data and trying to punish. But if we could get principals and teachers and communities to see the value of the voice and the value of the sustainability of it in terms of bringing. So for example, in California, we actually see a heavier use of this data in a positive way, because after 10 or 15 years, we were able to convince the state legislature to create another funding source. So if the kids and teachers and parents use this data, came up with their own ground up interventions, they could apply for the state for a grant called the LCAP, particularly low income in schools, other things. So now you actually get a lot of money for it. So it's a slight over time changing each one of these things from a punitive perspective, as you're saying, to one that is building, but it's not automatic for sure. And it is something that we see all over the world, this tension between should the voices be used to uplift or should the voices to be used to punish. And I would urge, as you said, that we have to have strategies around that. It's not an all or nothing, but amazingly, we were able to convince very conservative politicians by coming to those gardens and going to those city celebrations and listening to how they organize them. I could give examples from Israel and other places as well, but I think the Latin context, particularly what we saw in Chile, there's a huge value of children, and there's a tremendous value in terms of imagining the future through these children. So I think if it's not just a monitoring system that goes to the higher ups and then they use it to punish or to reward, kind of from high on up, and it's this way up where we're actually learning from the communities, it's easier to sway people, because when you're sitting in front of a person and it's not abstract, it's a little bit harder to have these more punitive views. Not impossible, because we've seen that. One more thing, I don't know if we have time, but the places where we've had the greatest challenges were areas that had organized crime. And we could talk about more about that if you want to. And that's true in California and Canada, in Kosovo and Israel and Chile. But how you handle organized crime in and around school is a more complex issue, particularly around voice. And that's had to be a little bit more subtle and actually sometimes include gangs and sometimes include other community sources so that the schools become safe havens and uplift kids.
Sobre ese punto, yo seguiré en español. Sobre ese punto me parece, digamos, muy importante resaltar los retos en no solo, digamos, tener la participación y la aceptación de los profesores, sino también de los estudiantes. Y Colombia es un país que tiene muchos retos de clima escolar. En ciertas partes, en ciertas ciudades, el tema de las pandillas y la violencia y las fronteras invisibles llegando al colegio son un tema muy real. En otros casos es matoneo más dentro del colegio. En otros casos son temas de violencia familiar. No tenemos las masacres en los colegios de Estados Unidos, pero tenemos muchos de los otros problemas de todas formas. Y uno de los retos, digamos, el consumo de drogas también es algo que ustedes tocan en el libro, y, digamos, parte de lo que el libro promueve es hablar, empoderar y aprender de los estudiantes, pero para eso los estudiantes tienen que confiar también en estos sistemas. Y cómo generar confianza entre los estudiantes para que digan la verdad, tanto sobre cosas como el consumo de drogas o psicoactivos, como cosas más riesgosas, como que sientan miedo a delatar ciertas estructuras por miedo a que a la retaliación, que los castiguen, no ya el sistema escolar, sino las pandillas, los bullies, cómo generar esa confianza entre los estudiantes.
It's a great question, and thank you for that. So there's a couple of things that are important to know before, and one of our theoretical conceptions, and this is something that we could argue as academicians on whether it's true or not, but Rami, Benbenishty, and myself have come to the belief, based on the data that we've seen around the world, that it is possible, it's not always, if a school is tremendously uplifting and has a staff that's very dedicated, and parents and kids that come together, when that happens, the school can become a vaccine of some sort to what's happening in the outside world. Because sometimes we see the school as just a reflection of the outside world. Sometimes people have a conception of the school as this is what is, but the school is actually a picture of the future of where you want to lift to. So you have to kind of wrestle within your own head. A school is not a school is not a school, to kind of paraphrase Gertrude Stein's "A rose is not a rose is a rose." It depends on how you see it. And the way we see it is it's possible for schools, if they're organized correctly with the right resources, with the right, more positive, uplifting views that you mentioned earlier, to take kids who are in extreme risk, including gangs, including organized crime, including threats and very high risks. And we actually have this in the data. I'll give you an example of you. And if a kid who was treated because of family violence and community violence and gang violence all around, had all these risk factors, and attended school A that had this loving, caring, uplifting welcome, versus school B, the kid in school A's likelihood of actually going to college, doing well, getting a good job, and creating a different vision of the future is highly likely. And that's actually what we see in our data. We see the kids in those schools where they use these ground level resources and make it uplifting. In other words, the kids are also reporting their teachers are caring for them more, they feel more belonging to school, they feel that they're making more friends. Amazingly, we didn't predict this originally, but now 30 years later, this is the advantage of being an old man, is I could look back and say, we were wrong. This actually works. It's not only a reflection of the whole society. In other words, it's not determined by the community or by everything they're going. The school actually offers a portal, a vision of a different kind of future. So I'll give you the example from the data, and if anybody's interested, I could send them the article of what we did in California with 145 schools, very low income, very gang oriented, high crime, high substance use. The substance use reductions were higher than the violence. I mean, we're more steeper than the thing. We're talking about 60 to 80% reductions, and we're talking about heroin, and we're talking about opioids, and we're talking about cocaine. For kids who attended the most caring schools through the monitoring process, we saw drug reduction. We had about a 45% reduction in initial gang affiliation. So the reason why I say it started as a vaccine is because it's not that they were in gangs and they dropped out. The kids who attended that school never joined gangs afterwards. They actually never took their first drug. So these are true primary preventions by their, and the way I see it when I'm on the ground with the schools in terms of convincing is we created really positive peer groups through sports, after school activities, connections with universities where they were automatic. This was all through the monitoring process where they brought in. So a kid who attended that school knew that they would get into college. They had a way out. They'd get a job or an internship. They had a great group of friends that they loved going to school with. They didn't want to join a gang at that point. So how do we find this out? Every question that we ask is anonymous, whether it's a mapping, whether it's this, and then we compile all that. So nobody is needing to tell about another situation. And if it is very specific and we think it's that, we tell the student not to tell us. We don't want to know if it's going to put you at risk or your friends at risk. So when we come back to the group, it's collective. You have thousands of kids who have reported it at a grade level or teachers. It's not something that we would ever present. And the same with the qualitative data, by the way. We don't take each individual's data, we compile it into one chart, and then we don't talk about individuals. So for example, the mapping procedure. It's a very different thing saying, well, who did this to you at the bus stop after school on your way to school, to say, what's happening on this street? You know, and they don't have to tell us about individuals. They could say, you know, as I'm leaving at 3 o'clock at the gate, this is and we stop them in the focus groups and say, don't tell us specifically about name. We don't want you to get in trouble. We want to know what we could do. So again, in California, when students have told us this about, they actually have moved, the city has moved bus stops so they won't be between two rival gang areas. They've actually increased the number of older kids who are in large numbers there together so that the gang members don't want to get close, and to do it, they moved it to a place that's safer. We brought out more parents just to hang out, who were able to hang out and create corridors of safety, all based on the student reporting anonymously in large numbers with their solutions, saying we should go this way and not that way. The buses should go here instead of there. Street lights in Israel was another thing. The girls were mentioning that they were really afraid after school hours, that they were afraid of getting raped. So the city actually took that data, created more street lights, more monitors, more people around so that people could get in. Same with the female teachers. So I could go on and on with examples, but over a period of 5-10, this is not something that happens like that. Over a period of time, listening and continue, you build that trust because people see, oh, I didn't just fill out that form that I want to commit suicide, and who knows what happened. The teacher came back and talked to us as a class. What can we do in our class to make this better? What are resources available? So you could see a reaction. Same with the bus stop, same with the garden, same with, I think if kids and teachers and parents see you responding to their voices in the surveys or in the mapping, then that's how trust is created. You may not do everything that they say, but collectively, there's an interaction. It's not just, okay, I filled out the form, I'm done. But that's actually what happened in California for about 25 years. Kids would write, I want to commit suicide. I brought a gun to school. I'm a member of a gang. Nobody looked at it at the local. Nobody used it. Nobody went off to some governor's office. That's not good. That doesn't help. But when it comes back and the teacher says, ooh, I got 10% of my kids in my class gang members. 30% want to commit suicide. There's 15% on opioids right now. How am I going to change my teaching? How is my classroom going to feel like?
De acuerdo, muy interesante. Yo tenía una última pregunta, si podemos tocar en ese tema, y no sé, Laura, si tú quieras intervenir también. Esta pregunta que les hice al principio, y es sobre cómo ha cambiado este tema del clima escolar en los últimos años con estos aspectos del social media y que se oye sobre todo, por lo menos en las noticias y en general, está empeorando la salud mental de los niños, de los jóvenes, adolescentes, y cómo cambia esto la estructura de ciertas de estas estos fenómenos que ustedes estudian, como el matoneo, como la violencia, que no, la violencia no tiene que ser no física, puede ser a través de un bullying online y ese tipo de cosas. No sé si han visto cambios recientes que creo que son relevantes para todos los países, incluyendo Colombia, y cómo esto afecta a estos sistemas de recoge de información que dependen un poco de poder observar en ciertos casos estas situaciones. No sé, Laura, si tú quieres decir algo.
Pues, Stephanie, yo quería intervenir un poquito en la pregunta. Pues antes voy a hacer una pequeñísima intervención solo para resaltar 4 puntos que me parece que son muy importantes, que han sido como mencionados en toda esta conversación. El primero es cómo la recolección de datos o el proceso de recolección de datos en este proceso monitoreo debe estar como permeado por una confianza de parte de, pues que exista cierta confianza en la relación de la persona recolectando los datos y de los participantes, digamos, que en este caso serían más que todo o primordialmente estudiantes, pero también profesores, conductores de buses, personas que trabajan en la cafetería de los colegios, en el aseo nocturno, durante el día, etcétera, etcétera. Y parte de lo que mencionamos en esta guía es que esta confianza se puede hacer por medio de tener personas quienes estén recolectando estos datos en el proceso de monitoreo que tengan ese rol exclusivamente, o sea, que sean expertos en este tipo de recolección de datos y no necesariamente que sea un profesor quien está teniendo que moderar los grupos focales o haciendo las encuestas, diseñando la encuesta como tal. Sé que esto genera otras dificultades y otros obstáculos, pero pues ese sería como el mundo ideal hablando con respecto a ese tema de la confianza. El segundo tema que quería mencionar también fue pues solamente resaltar porque ya fue mencionado, es sobre cómo cuando se recolectan los datos también es importante no quedarnos en recolectamos estos datos del proceso de monitoreo y no tuvimos nada que hacer con esto. Entonces también tener un plan previamente de qué vamos a hacer y cómo vamos a analizar, quién va a estar encargado de hacerle un seguimiento a este análisis de datos, porque nosotros no solamente queremos tener una cantidad de información, sino vamos a tener cómo manejar o cómo utilizar esta información pues para cambios o propuestas o ideas. Entonces, será como mi segundo punto. Relacionado a este, quería resaltar la importancia de volver a traer estos datos a los estudiantes, o sea, poder hacer como ese chequeo o esa revisión de, mira, esto fue lo que entendimos al hacer el análisis de los grupos focales, ¿están de acuerdo? ¿Qué opinan sobre esto? ¿Sí les parece que es coherente con respecto a lo que ustedes piensan, a sus vivencias, a sus experiencias? Tercer punto. Y cuarto punto, todo este proceso de monitoreo, una cosa que a mí me parece fundamental y es importante que pues como que quede ahí, es la importancia de tener la posibilidad de diferentes percepciones dentro de los mismos estudiantes, y esto ustedes lo mencionaron, que fue como que a veces existe una percepción de los profesores de estos son los riesgos que los estudiantes tienen, y después cuando hablamos con los estudiantes dicen, no, 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 eso no es lo que a mí me está pasando, es todo esto. Entonces tener esta conversación por intermedio de datos, diferentes percepciones y pues diferentes experiencias y puntos de vista de la realidad y posicionalidad de cada uno de estos actores, pues me parece súper importante y es algo que buscamos aportar por medio de esta guía para construir un clima escolar seguro. Y ahora sí, con respecto a las redes sociales, le dejo el micrófono a el profesor Astor.
Gracias, Laura.
Thanks for passing the baton. Yeah, I'll go quickly because I know our time is almost up. But social media has been interesting because it's pretty recent, right? And when we started doing all this stuff, it didn't exist. There wasn't any. But all we heard about at the time is children sitting and watching TV, that they weren't going out, that they weren't just on TV, that they were at home for 7 or 8 hours a day. In my mind, that's been substituted with social media. When you look at the average here in the United States for girls right now, there's a direct relation to spending 6 or 7 hours a day and having depression. That's not surprising, whether it's TV or other things. Over time, what's happened in most countries that have started developing this kind of process is they start incorporating stuff that they thought was on the outside or wasn't part of what the school was supposed to do, to actually making it part of what the school has to do. And I'll give you a couple examples. Bullying, cyberbullying, almost 90+% of that happens with peers from the same classes in those schools. So the cyberbullying place is just another playground where there isn't an adult. When the adults, parents, whatever say, well, no, if you can't do it in the bathroom or the playground or around it, you can't do it online. You can't say these things, do these things. And you actually educate about it and create policies about it and work with parents and kids about it and treat it like you would any other context, we see massive reductions in terms of that at schools here. More than 70% reductions when schools actually take responsibility. Secondly, I think, you know, there's a lot of information out there, and I think schools could do a lot to educate on what is healthy development. Because again, just like watching TV 7 or 8 hours a day or sitting at home by yourself 7 hours, it means that you're not doing other things. That's the biggest issue. They're not playing with friends, they're not doing arts, they're not learning new things, they're not around positive social groups. I think if schools could build those into their structures, that would be helpful. In the United States, before the internet, some of the earlier research was showing that some of the biggest impact on kids was between 3 and 8 in the afternoon, coming from criminology. And most developed countries started to develop programs to actually have social sports, arts, other things in those period of time, so kids would be positively connected. That had a really big impact on crime and on crime reduction during those periods of time, and we forget about that. I think similar strategies could be used by schools and cultures around the internet. How do we fill kids' time with things that we believe are uplifting and positive? The problem that I see is that a lot of the adults are spending 6 or 7 or 8 hours on social media as well. They're stuck to their phones like this. So there may need to be some discussions on what's healthy, what's productive, particularly in the Colombian context, and what do we want to be? If everybody's always had their phone in front of them, you can't get them to stop in a meeting, obviously you're not going to get the kids to do that. But I think it's overtaken the time and space that many adults and children have right now. We have to do some reflection on what's the balance, what's the right things where kids could use it to learn, to grow, to use it, but on the other hand, it doesn't take out 7 to 10 hours of their day.
Thank you, Ron. Muchas gracias a los dos. Creo que se nos acabó el tiempo, pero quería agradecerles por esta gran discusión y por el libro, que realmente recomiendo que vayan a la feria y lo compren. Creo que va a ser muy, muy útil para tanto colegios como cualquier entidad que esté interesada en recolectar datos y aprender de las personas con las que está trabajando. Entonces, muchísimas gracias de nuevo a Ron y a Laura por esta conversación. Y esperamos que puedan conseguir el libro.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ron.